The movie begins with a woman lying in a large field. Her eyes are closed as a series of images and scenes from her life flash before her eyes. Her name is Araminta, also called Minty. Minty is a slave, and she is remembering all the suffering she had to go through while working for her white masters. These experiences include working in the field non-stop, under the burning heat of the sun, being beaten as a child, and getting separated from her family as her other sisters were sold off to other owners. Suddenly, she blinks open her eyes to find her husband, John Tubman, standing there, right over her. The year is 1849 in the heart of Bucktown, Maryland, a place where slavery hangs heavy in the air. Minty and John Tubman, fresh off their wedding, are dreaming big to start a family, and more than anything, they want their kids to be born into freedom. It is revealed that Minty is a slave on the Brodess plantation. Her mom, Harriet, her sister Rachel, her brothers, they're all in the same boat suffering at the hands of their white masters. John has just trotted back from the city, and Minty is happy to see him. He is holding a letter in his hand and tells her that we made it. Harriet jumps with excitement and practically snatches it out of his hands. Turns out, it's from a lawyer, and it says that Minty's mom, Harriet, is finally free. And not just her kids too, including Minty herself. The scene shifts and we see the preacher Reverend Green, who is singing a hymn in front of a small church, with the rest of the congregation singing along with him. At the front of the house, we see their white masters, the Brodess family, watching and singing along. Reverend Green finishes his sermon by talking about obedience and following the Lord's will, which includes wholeheartedly serving their earthly masters pertaining to the Brodess family. When everyone is gone, Ben, Minty's father, a freedman, asks to speak with the farm owner, Edward Brodess. He introduces John to him and tells him that he is a free man. Then he reminds Brodess that his wife Harriet is now 57 years old when she should have been free when she turned 45. Instead, she is still working on the plantation as a slave. Ben then hands Brodess the letter, and Minty tells him how she would like to have a family with John and for their children to be free. Brodess reads the letter but angrily tears it up, telling them that they have no right to demand things from him. He tells Minty that she is her property and that her children and their children will always belong to him. Minty begins crying while Harriet screams and cries, calling Brodess an evil man. John takes Minty away and she runs toward the forest. In her despair, Minty falls to the ground and prays for God to take Brodess's life, as he is the devil. While she's crying, Brodess's adult son Gideon approaches her and hears her prayers. He also insults Minty, reminding her that she is just a little slave, and when she tries to fight back, he slaps her across the face and tells her to come back home to work. At night, Minty hears some screams, and not long after, Edward Brodess dies. During his funeral, Eliza is crying with despair while Gideon is giving angry looks to Minty. He believes that it is due to her prayers his father is dead. Gideon, now the head of the family, immediately puts Minty up for sale, putting up posters himself. Meanwhile, Minty, who suffers strange visions and vivid dreams since being struck in the head as a girl, is constantly bombarded with visions of the past. One day, as she is cutting some wood, she has visions of herself escaping to freedom. She describes these scenes as visions from God and decides to escape. While working in the field, Minty sees one of their masters approaching and is struck with panic that she might be sold off soon. Suddenly, she decides to run and find John. She hurriedly tells him that she's running away, and he decides to accompany her. At first, Minty hesitates to take him with her because she fears that if they catch both of them, they will harm John and take his freedom too. But when he insists, Minty tells John to wait by the gate and keep watch, as she says goodbye to her mother. Back at the field, one of the masters notices that Minty is gone from her post and goes to look for her. Minty goes near her mother and sings a song to say goodbye to her. Harriet immediately understands and sings back to her. Then, Minty runs toward their house to prepare for escape. As she gets ready, she decides to leave John behind, fearing that he will lose his freedom. Meanwhile, John waits by the gate until nighttime, but decides to leave when he realizes that Minty is not coming for him as she promised. As he turns to leave, he is met by Gideon asks why he's there. He lies and tells him that he's there to see his wife, as Gideon is informed of Minty's disappearance. This prompts Gideon to strike John. On the other hand, Minty goes to a cabin and meets with her father, who tells her to go to Reverend Green for help with her journey. Minty protests and argues that Reverend Green would not agree to her running away since he's always preaching about obedience. But Minty's father insists and packs her food to take with her on her journey. Minty listens to him and arrives at Reverend Green's church and asks him to pray for her journey. Reverend Green then gives her advice and tells her where to go and to find a white man named Thomas Garrett, who is an abolitionist who fights for the freedom of slaves. Minty travels all night, but soon she is pursued by Gideon and other men on horseback. They bring some dogs with them who smell Minty and follow her. Minty runs into the jungle to escape them, but eventually, Gideon corners her at a bridge over a river, where he appeals to her faith and even promises not to sell her. However, Minty jumps off the bridge anyway, telling her pursuers that she would rather die than continue to be a slave. As Minty jumps into the river, she is presumed drowned by the birdesses, but she manages to survive and sneak into a carriage, which takes her far enough until the driver tells her to get off. He lets her go and she, once again, travels all night towards town. As she reaches the town in a miserable state, she meets a stranger with a boat. The stranger looks at her and covers her with a cloak. Then, she asks him about Wilmington, Delaware, and he shows him the way. So, with the help of a stranger, she successfully makes it to Wilmington, Delaware, and locates Thomas Garrett. Once she finds him, Minty collapses out of exhaustion and wakes up in an unfamiliar bed. When she regains her strength, Thomas Garrett takes her to the Pennsylvania border. After dropping her there, he guides her and Minty walks the remaining 25 miles to Philadelphia, where she meets William Still, chairman of the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society. William welcomes her and takes her to his office. He takes her personal information and encourages her to take a new name to mark her freedom. Minty thinks for a second, and then she chooses Harriet after her mother and Tubman after her husband. After telling William her story, he takes her to Marie Buchanan's place, where she is offered free lodging. Marie is the daughter of a freed slave who was born free and is now the owner of a boarding house. Marie gives comfort to Minty and introduces her to the rest of the people in the house. Then she helps her take a warm bath and gives her some fresh clothes to wear. Minty is momentarily thrown off by Marie's lifestyle as a freedman, but later adjusts and starts working for her, helping around the boarding house, cleaning and changing the sheets, this time with pay. A year passes by, and after living a year in Philadelphia, Minty's longing for her family grows more and more each day. Unable to take the burden any longer, Minty begs William to assist in bringing her family over. He tells her that helping slaves has become harder recently. They argue, but William persists, and Minty leaves, having already made the decision to save her family. After this, Minty asks Marie to help her. Marie readily agrees and teaches her the ways of a free black woman. She also gives her a gun for her safety. Soon enough, Minty is boarding a train to Maryland, carrying fake documents and pretending to be someone else. She successfully makes it to John's home, only to find that he is remarried and is expecting a child. Having nowhere else to go, Minty spends the night in the forest where no one can see her. As she is crying with despair, she falls to the ground and receives more visions. Meanwhile, Gideon and his mother Eliza are desperate for money. They decide to sell Minty's brothers as they can get a good price for selling young and healthy slaves. Meanwhile, Minty is found by her father lying unconscious on the grass. Minty is happy to be with her family again, but her father informs her about the situation. That same night, Minty decides to save other slaves. She then leads 9 other slaves to safety along with her brothers, 5 of them being from Gideon's farm. She leaves her father, mother, and sister Rachel behind, but promises to come back for them later. The next day, Gideon finds out about the runaway slaves and threatens Rachel. Fearful for her children, she tells him that it was Minty who took the slaves, but he doesn't believe her. In desperation, Gideon gathers a group of slave catchers and promises them a $300 reward to whoever finds the runaways alive and unharmed. On the other hand, after traveling the whole night, braving the weather, and crossing rivers, Minty and the rest make it to Philadelphia. The next day, William introduces Minty to a secret group called the Underground Railroad, whose only purpose is to free slaves and bring them to safety. It is revealed that only those who have freed slaves on their own can get access to this group. Minty is happy to be a part of the group and realizes that it's her life's mission now. Over the next few months, Minty managed to free more slaves. She finally decides to try and free her sister, but William warns her against it and reminds her how dangerous it could be since Rachel works in the Broaddus household. However, Minty persists and takes journeys to get her sister. Back in Maryland, Minty waits until nightfall to contact Rachel. She quietly calls out to her at the window, and they reunite. Minty urges Rachel to run away with her, but Rachel refuses, explaining that she can't leave her children behind. Tragically, Gideon has sold her children, and Rachel clings to the hope of finding them one day. Heartbroken, Minty sets off alone but unexpectedly gains an ally, Walter, a man who once worked for Gideon to track runaway slaves. Walter, seeking redemption for his past, offers to help Minty. Together, they narrowly escape from their pursuers. A few months later, the Fugitive Slave Act is passed, giving slave owners the right to recapture escaped slaves, even in free states. Minty faces danger once again when she witnesses Marie being killed by Gideon and another slave catcher. Determined to survive, Minty flees to Canada with help from her allies in the Underground Railroad. While in Canada, Minty learns of her sister's death and has a vision that her father is in grave danger. Resolute, she decides to return to Maryland to rescue both her parents and bring them to safety. Minty first goes to her mother and convinces her to escape with her. Together, they find her father, and the three begin their journey to Canada with Walter's help. Meanwhile, back at the Brodess household, Eliza Brodess grows ill as the farm faces financial ruin. Paranoid and fearing for her life, she becomes convinced the slaves are poisoning her food. One day, their neighbors confront the Brodess family, accusing them of being responsible for their own lost slaves and misfortunes after learning the runaways were freed by someone connected to the Brodess farm. Desperate, Eliza devises a plan to use Rachel's children as bait to trap Minty. But when she returns home, she finds her own children tied up and Rachel's children gone. As the community blocks all exits, Minty and her group manage to cross the bridge, hidden inside a chariot. They finally reach safety and wait by the river for a boat to take them to freedom. Sitting with her mother on the riverbank, Minty promises to care for her and make sure she is happy once they reach Canada. When the boat arrives, Minty senses danger approaching. Ensuring her group is safe, she makes Walter promise to protect everyone before leaving to face the threat. She confronts Gideon, shooting his hand and forcing him off his horse. Gideon tries to assert his ownership over her, but Minty boldly declares that she was never anyone's property. Minty threatens Gideon with the gun but chooses to shoot a tree instead, declaring that God did not create people to own one another. She takes his horse and rides away, leaving him alone in the forest. In Canada, Minty's parents live peacefully as free people, while Minty continues her mission to free others. During the Civil War, now known as Harriet Tubman, she leads an armed expedition of 150 black soldiers in the Combahee River Raid, freeing over 750 slaves. Over the years, Harriet personally frees more than 70 slaves, serves as a Union spy during the war, and becomes a strong advocate for women's suffrage. Harriet Tubman passes away at the age of approximately 91 and leaves behind a legacy of courage and freedom. Her final words were, "I go to prepare a place for you." This is where the movie ends. What inspired you most about Harriet Tubman's story? Share your thoughts below, and thank you for watching.